Welcome to this recorded webinar from November 7th, 2024 about San Francisco Bay water quality for open water swimmers. This event was hosted by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and we're going to jump right in. Thanks so much for listening.
So we just wanted to get a sense of how often you all are swimming in the bay. And it looks like, well, we got 11 people answering so far, but no first timers, which is noticeable, which is probably why you all care about being here and what the water quality is like. Great. Got some daily swimmers. All right, I'm going to go to the next question here, which is about how long you've been swimming in the bay. If this is your first year, if you've been swimming for a couple years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, or over 20 years. That's awesome. I know a lot of people kind of took to the bay during the COVID pandemic when it was hard to get time in a pool or the pools were closed. So it kind of fits the 2 to 5 year trend here where most people were getting in the water. It's amazing. And this next question is really about what inspires you to swim in open water. And Alex and I were testing this question, and I have to admit, I'm curious what if there's a variation, because we kind of pushed it all the way to 10 on all of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, connecting with nature and sense of adventure definitely is a thrill. So definitely feel that, and the mental health, the fitness, and community all are kind of things that keep drawing us to the water. So thanks for answering those questions. We'll come back to this as just a way to engage and exchange information with you all. But first, I'm going to pass it to Alex to just share a little bit about Odyssey.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. My name is Alex Thompson, and I am the one of the new leadership members at Odyssey Open Water. We are an open water swimming company based out of Berkeley. We have two main models of our organization. We organize events such as swimming from Alcatraz or Bridge to Bridge or the Golden Gate. And we also facilitate weekly community swims in Berkeley at the marina. So in the summertime, we host on Sundays and Tuesdays. And in the wintertime, we host on just Sunday mornings. It's really fun and a great way to get out and take advantage of all of those open water attributes that you guys had just discussed. So back in August of this year, a group of folks and myself took over Odyssey. And one of the things that we wanted to be really intentional about is acknowledging that, we're an open water swimming organization, and water health is really important to us. And it just so happened that Emily here is on the paddler roster of ours, and there was just some kismet going on. And we both kind of arrived at this idea of it would be great if I could have some of the questions that I often get about open water swimming and water quality, get them answered by these professionals at SFEI. So we just want to be intentional about seeking partnerships that are doing really good work in the Bay. And like I said, water is important to us. And so we are just really thankful for organizations like SFEI who are putting in good work and labor and manpower and brain power to keep improving our Bay water quality.
Thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate it. And Yeah, I love to swim in the bay. I love to paddle in the bay. And that's, yeah, the main way that we've connected. And I know I often have a lot of questions myself about the water quality on any given day. So,
Yeah.
yeah, glad to be kind of starting the conversation here. So, SFEI, it's a acronym that stands for the San Francisco Estuary Institute. We are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to deliver visionary science to empower people to revitalize nature in our communities. And we're home to one of the nation's premier water quality science programs that has a long history of water quality monitoring in the Bay. And by long, I mean over 30 years. The monitoring and science from SFEI is one of the reasons that Bay water quality has actually improved in the last 25 years, even though our population has increased by 1.5 million people. We use aerial drones, water sensors, field crews to collect millions of data points. And over the years, we've created more than 50 online and mobile tools to present and share that data in dynamic and expressive ways. And we also provide the science to redesign landscapes to brace for bigger storms, longer droughts, heat waves, and sea level rise. So science is real. And we need to improve our communications to connect our scientific insights to a much broader audience. Like, for example, being able to connect our 30 years of water quality data and expertise with the open water swim community who are interacting with the water in the Bay on a daily, weekly, occasionally time scale. So we really want to be improving how and with whom we communicate about our work so we can really meet the urgency of the moment that we're in. So I want to take us back to the Mentimeter. If you've just joined us, Katie's going to paste a link in the chat to take you to this Mentimeter poll that we're using, or I'm going to leave this QR code up so you can navigate back to this survey, and we'll kind of enter part 2, which is all about kind of now focusing on the primary concerns that you have when you're swimming in the Bay. And the different ones you'll see when you get there into the survey, and that we'll talk a little bit about today. Some of these things, we're mostly going to obviously focus on water quality, but we'll talk about other concerns you might have related to temperature, wildlife, currents, and visibility, or other things that might concern you that aren't one of those things. We'd love to hear about that too in the chat. So I'm not seeing anybody over here in the survey yet. Oh, it's because I'm not presenting. Okay, stand by. Here it comes. So hopefully you're here, and we'd love to hear what things are kind of going through your mind as you're swimming in the Bay that might be concerning. And this is the same type of question as the previous one, where you can kind of toggle and drag the kind of how much it's bothering you or not at all. Yeah, I mean, I guess there is a correlation that you're all here today to talk about water quality, that seems to be one of the ones that's rising to the top here. So temperature, not so much. Currents, definitely. Invisibility, not too much. And then the second question here is, what factor do you think has the most significant impact on Bay water quality? There's a little bit of a knowledge check. I think Jay will go into a lot more detail about this, but just looking at these 4 different types of water that have the potential to enter the Bay, be it stormwater runoff, industrial waste, overflows from our wastewater treatment plants, or sewage overflows, or recreational boating. Tight race. But it looks like sewage overflows and stormwater runoff. Ooh, it's like too close to call between the concerns from stormwater, sewage, and industrial wastes. So I think that's a good segue back to Jay, but do encourage you to add or include any questions here that you want Jay to answer. And I kind of, if you've just joined, we've got a lot of questions. I don't think we'll have time to hit them all, but we're going to try and get through as many as we can. So please feel free to add your questions here. And just as also, if there are some questions that are more related to like the logistics of swimming, Alex is going to try and answer those more in the chat. And I think Andrea Ventura from Clean Water Action is also going to be potentially available to help us in the chat answer some questions more related to advocacy, because the San Francisco Estuary Institute is really a science-based organization, not working on advocacy. So with that, I'm going to come back to our presentation, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jay Davis. Jay leads our clean water program and has been working on contaminant issues in San Francisco Bay since 1986, which is to say the entire time that SFEI has existed. So almost. Yeah. Okay. So Jay, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. It's great to be here and have the opportunity to talk about bay water quality with this group that loves the Bay and is interested in learning more about bay water quality. I'm the lead scientist for the Regional Monitoring Program for Water Quality in San Francisco Bay. It's the main program for monitoring water quality in the Bay. The program started in 1993. I started with the Institute in the 80s, but then went away to get my PhD at UC Davis, and then came back in 1995. So I've been working with the Regional Monitoring Program since 1995. And it's a big multifaceted program that I'm only going to say a little bit about here today, but you can look us up on our website and get more information. But it's one of the, thanks to this program, we have one of the best monitored water bodies in the world. And a key ingredient for that is funding. We've had stable funding since the 90s, and currently it's at about $4 million a year. It's actually, we get, that's our base funding, and we actually get more than that. It's well funded, and we've been making good use of the funds to monitor the things that need to be monitored in the Bay. We look at a lot of pollutants. Our main focus is on toxic pollutants in this program. But I'm not going to talk much about toxic pollutants today because for swimmers don't really need to be that concerned about the toxic pollutants that we're tracking. They can be toxic when they accumulate in the food chain and accumulate in fish. And if you eat fish regularly from the Bay, then you could be getting exposures that kind of heighten your risk for certain health problems. But the toxics in the water, your exposure through swimming is quite low, and there's not really any reason to be concerned about toxics in the Bay unless you're in a particularly polluted area where there's like noticeable pollution, maybe oil pollution. One of the questions that we got before the meeting was about creosote in the Bay. And if you're in a place where you can smell the pollution, then that's probably not a good sign. But aside from those situations, you don't really need to worry about toxics, but you do need to worry about pathogens. So that's what I'll mainly talk about. But before I get to pathogens, I want to mention a report that we put out every other year called the Pulse of the Bay, which is intended for non-technical folks. Accessible information about bay water quality. we have a theme every time we put the report out, and the theme this year was contaminants of emerging concern. The Bay is at the cutting edge of science on contaminants of emerging concern, and I recommend that you take a look at this. It's a sort of go-to guide on these contaminants in the Bay, and you can learn a lot about all the different contaminants that are out there. There are a lot of them, but again, not the focus today because swimmers don't need to be that concerned about them. Next slide. You've probably heard a lot about PFAS. It's major concern for drinking water. It's also a concern for contamination, accumulation in fish. It's not really a concern for swimmers, but we generated this nice diagram about how contaminants get to the Bay for PFAS. And it was in this, the Pulse that just came out a couple of weeks ago. So I wanted to go over this pathways diagram because the pathways for all pollutants or the general pathways are the same. The major pathways for most things are municipal wastewater. For pathogens, if our treatment plants weren't functioning well, and they function very well, they treat our sewage, and for the most part, except for when there are overflows and that exceed the capacity of the system, and we do get some untreated or lightly treated sewage going to the Bay, they do a great job of removing pathogens and treating our sewage. So we'll probably talk more later about treatment plant overflows. You guys were pretty spot on in your identification of pathways for getting to the Bay. Stormwater runoff is a major pathway to be concerned about. And you need to be, one of my main messages is that you need to be aware of rainfall and follow the general advice about swimming after storms, because the stormwater washes pathogens that are in waste from a variety of sources, fecal waste from a variety of sources from our watersheds into the Bay and cause elevated concentrations. Industrial wastewater isn't really much of a source. The ones to really focus on are the stormwater runoff and then sometimes the municipal wastewater. Next slide. Okay, so is the Bay safe for swimming? I don't swim in the Bay myself or in open water, but I do have a connection to open water swimming because my wife, Nicole, is a very avid open water swimmer. We live in Half Moon Bay and she swims in the ocean several days a week. And she also participates and has been helping to organize a great event called Swim Across America. Wait, don't go from the photo yet, Emily. I took this photo from the Hornblower Yacht, where a few years ago, up until the pandemic, we used to go out on the Hornblower Yacht, and it would drop the swimmers below the Golden Gate Bridge, and they would swim over to Crissy Field. So that's where this photo came from. Okay, next slide. So I do want to make a quick plug for Swim Across America. It's been going for, well, this was the 19th year this year. It happens every year in October. They raise money for child cancer research, UCSF Benioff Hospital. And this year they raised $600,000. They raise about that amount every year. It's a great cause, great event. It's inspiring to go and hear the stories about these folks and swim with them in the Bay. Okay, next slide. So the Bay is safe for swimming. The Bay is clean, and especially compared to what the Bay used to be like. And in the Pulse of the Bay in 2022, our theme was the impact of the Clean Water Act. And thanks to the Clean Water Act, wastewater treatment was implemented around the Bay. Before the Clean Water Act in 1972, the Bay was not safe for swimming. We found this historic photo from 1938 about a newly constructed beach south of Candlestick Point. But even back in the 30s, there were health authorities doing some monitoring, and the quote explains that swimming wasn't recommended because it was found to be polluted. But they were looking forward to a day when a sewage project will correct the condition and make the water safe for swimming. So even back then, the problem was known. Up through the 60s and until the Clean Water Act really provided funding for wastewater treatment, the Bay was known as a stinking cesspool with high counts of pathogens and a lot of other contaminants. But in the 70s, with funding from the Clean Water Act, we really cleaned things up significantly. Next slide. So I like this slide. It's the graphic is a little dated. It's from a State of the Estuary report where we did a report card, and whether the Bay is safe for swimming is one of the indicators for water quality. But I like the graphic, and it explains some basic things. So we like to use a letter grade scale for this indicator, and A, B, C, D scale, and A's and B's are good, C is fair, and the D or F is poor. Overall, the status of the Bay is good. The Bay is safe for swimming in general. We aren't seeing trends in things like getting more into the A plus category, or things getting worse. Our wastewater treatment is working well. We do have some problems that I'll talk about. The benchmark for measuring this is the state established thresholds for indicator bacteria. So the key data for whether the Bay is safe for swimming are indicator bacteria. Next slide. So there are 3 types of bacteria that are measured, listed here. These bacteria can be found in the digestive tracts of mammals and birds. So these bacteria are indicators of all the pathogens that can be found in untreated stormwater or wastewater. So viruses are another big component of the pathogen mix out there, but viruses are harder to measure. So we measure the bacteria because they're a good indicator. They're of concern themselves, but also they're a good indicator of the presence of inadequately treated waters coming into the Bay. Next slide. So one of the main things I want you to take away from this are sources of information on bacteria, the bacterial quality of the Bay. The basic source of information are the few organizations, counties, the East Bay Regional Park District, that perform regular monitoring of bacterial concentrations at swimming locations. So I picked San Mateo County because I'm familiar with that, and San Mateo County does a lot of monitoring at many beaches. They've got a great interactive map website where you can see all the places that are monitored, and click on a point like I did here, and it's showing the most recent data for Aquatic Park. The monitoring is done weekly. So this shows the sample date of October 28th for Aquatic Park and the concentrations that they measured. So this is a great source of information. And that's the raw data that I'm going to show some other places that show the data and kind of present it in different ways. But this is the source of the information, the counties and the groups that do the monitoring. Next slide. this is a screenshot of my email. You can sign up for on email lists for San Mateo County, and I presume other counties or other groups that are doing the monitoring. And so every week I get a report on the latest data for San Mateo County beaches. So that's very handy, and you can, this just comes into my inbox once a week, and I have an idea of what's going on. Next slide. One of the groups that's really great at presenting the information that, the kind of taking the raw data from the counties and other groups that do the monitoring and presenting it in a useful way is a group called Heal the Bay. They're from Southern California. One of the things they do every year is put out a beach report card report. And they do a great job of taking the raw data, turning it into letter grades, and presenting it in a useful way. Next slide. So one of the things they do that gets media attention every year is they have a list of beach bummers. These are beaches where the grades are Fs, and there are a couple in the Bay Area. San Mateo County has a couple of problem areas. Lindemar Beach, this is not in the Bay, but it's on the ocean side, is one of the beach bummers. And then Lakeshore Park, which is near Foster City on the Bay side, is a Bay beach. Next slide. There's more information in the report. That there's a nice section on frequently asked questions. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's just refer you to this for good basic information on sort of on these frequently asked questions, and then also how the data, more information about how the data are turned into the letter grades. Next slide. So in the Pulse of the Bay, we include a summary of the beach report card information. So I take the Heal the Bay letter grades and just summarize them for the Bay. This is a good time for me to say I'm not a world expert on beach or bacterial monitoring. It's not something that we monitor in the RMP. Other groups are doing the monitoring, the counties and park districts. So I'm telling you what I know today, but I may not be able to answer all of your questions. But the main thing I do when we put out the Pulse of the Bay, I compile the data and come up with this overall assessment and overview of how we're doing. And so here's the long-term average grade for summer beach report card grade. So they're in the A to B range. So this is what I showed a summary of earlier, that we're in the A to B range, and that's good. So overall, the Bay is safe for swimming. Next slide. So that's the overview, but there are some, when you zoom in on some places, there are some problem areas, and I'm don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but in San Mateo County, there's a group of beaches in the Foster City area in lagoons where there's not a lot of flushing, and the 2023 data shows some Fs and Ds for those areas. So that beach bummer entry was from that area. But aside from San Mateo County and those poorly flushed areas, the grades in the summer are quite good. A's or A pluses for the most part. Next slide. Okay, this is a special peek behind the scenes of the Pulse, because I don't expect you to read this, but it makes a point that there are also, I showed the summer dry weather grades. In wet weather, the grades are not as good. And we don't really have time for you guys to try to take this in, but in 2023, at the bottom, you can see the average grades for the summer in the wet weather, and wet weather grade was 3.1, the GPA, which is not that much different from the summer, but in 2022, the wet weather grade was much lower at 2.13. I don't know why the grades were lower in 2022 in wet weather. Because 2023 was a pretty wet year. So that's something I don't know the answer to, but the main point here is that the wet weather grades are worse because stormwater carries in bacteria. Next slide. Heal the Bay also has a great interactive website. This is their homepage, and it shows their ABCD grading system. And then if you go to the next slide, if you scroll, move the map up to the Bay Area, they present the data very well, and they show the places that are monitored, and you can zoom in and one of the things that's neat is that it has this nowcast feature where the rings that are around the beaches show the likelihood, the probability of conditions being good for swimming, or maybe bacteria concentrations being something to be concerned about. So, and then also on the right, it shows all the places that are currently kind of in the center of the map. Next slide. So focusing in over on the Keller Beach area, it gives you the details of the Keller Beach south and north, and then you can click on the South Beach to get the data for that location. So let's go next slide. And so then it tells you the latest grade, who's doing the monitoring, and then I think a nice feature is at the bottom, it shows the time series of grades. So I think this is something that if I was swimming in the Bay, I would keep an eye on this and become familiar with the patterns of when there's contamination and how it relates to rainfall, because you can lower your risk that way. Next slide. There's another state water board website. It's called My Water Quality. I think the Heal the Bay interface is probably the most useful, but this is maybe more comprehensive about different data sets that are available. I'm just including it for completeness. Next slide. There are links for all of these resources that will be given to you, and they're in the slide deck. So this is, you can, just another way of looking at the data with the state water board website. Next slide. Okay, so my recommendations, and we'll talk more about your questions in Q&A, but my general recommendations are, I recommend that you become familiar with the monitoring data. It's easy to do. Heal the Bay in particular presents the data very well. I think it's good to swim in places where there is monitoring, and pick the spots that get better grades. So there's kind of a spatial choice to make, where do you swim? But you should weigh this with other safety considerations, thinking about access and tidal action. There's a lot of things to think about for safe swimming. This is just one. I think it's good to know what the patterns over time are, and if it seems like your location has had recent spikes in concentrations, and maybe think about another spot until that is showing signs of going down. And I think those nowcast predictions are useful. But you can be your own predictor if you pay attention to rainfall patterns or rainfall data. Storms that produce runoff are the ones to be concerned about. There's a general rule of thumb to not swim for 3 days after a storm. That's what Nicole has been doing for a long time, and she's never gotten sick from swimming in open water. In the county, the San Mateo County, it provides that same advice. You can also be your own monitor and collect your own data. Like, pay attention to if you get sick, and make sure you're paying attention to what the weather was like, or if you're swimming close to when a storm happened, pay attention and see if you get sick. See if, any other problems like Nicole has experienced headaches when she was swimming in an area where there was a lot of boat exhaust. So pay attention to things like that. Um, I think it's in general good to avoid algae blooms. On the coast, we get these brown tides, and we've had some major algal bloom events in the bay, and it's good to avoid the toxic algae. But overall, the bay is clean. You can keep your eye on the bacteria data and protect yourself from that. And you don't need to worry about the toxics that we're monitoring because they're not really leading to high exposures for swimmers. And enjoy your clean bay that's doing well now that, thanks to the Clean Water Act. And, get out there like Nicole and Emily do, as I'm showing in this photo here from the latest Swim Across America event.
Thanks, Jay. And I think Katie's going to paste some of the links to the resources that Jay shared into the chat. It's a lot, just in terms of the links that are about to get dropped into the chat, but I just wanted to let you know we'll email those out to folks afterwards. Maybe a couple that Jay didn't mention that I'll mention here. One is that within the Bay, there's a website called baywise.org, and in there you can actually zoom in and see where your nearest wastewater treatment plants are. Just if you're curious about who's treating your wastewater near to where you're swimming. And then bacteria and pathogens are obviously a concern for swimmers, but I know for myself, I care a lot about what the temperature is. And so I'm just also sharing a cool kind of nowcast and forecast looking 24 hours back and 24 hours forward from NOAA. And you can see throughout the bay how the temperature is changing. And then we also wanted to mention that some of our colleagues here at the San Francisco Estuary Institute and also with partners at other partner organizations are creating an interactive portal that's going to have an indicator that they're calling Safe for Swimming, and that's going to be coming in 2025. So I'm happy to share more about that with you all. But similarly, I think there's all of this information is in different places. And if you have suggestions for how it can be improved, we'd love to hear that. And our partners would love to hear that as well so that we can really make this information, useful for people who want it and depend on it. So that was a lot of us talking. We've got about 15 minutes left. It's Ask an Expert time. So I mentioned there's lots of questions here, but maybe Katie, if you want to put the link back in the chat to the Mentimeter, folks can drop questions there in the chat, or when you registered, you also asked some I think we have almost 30 questions here. So we're not going to do them all. We don't have time, but a couple that I've seen, and this was a fun one that I've experienced and I talked with Jay about, I think I've seen it twice, both in the Mentimeter and here, is what makes the beard after you swim? There's kind of like this fine layer of slippery, I always think of it as an algae, but after I swim, the question here, is it algae, pollutions, oils on the surface? What is that, Jay?
Yeah, well, I haven't, I've only heard you talk about it. Nicole, have you experienced the beard? Okay. But I think the answer is in that second part of the question. It's pollution. Well, it's oils on the surface in general. So it's algae produce oils. So in most parts of the bay where there's not a lot of, like oil pollution, there's still a natural oil layer that's on top of the water. Or, everybody knows it from salad dressing that oil and water don't mix. So the bay has a thin, they call it actually a surface micro layer of oil on top of the water that doesn't mix down into the water. And so, but that doesn't like to go in water, the oil, but it loves to stick to skin or solid objects. So I think that's what the beard is. And I think you don't, again, in general, not something to be concerned about, but like somebody mentioned swimming in a creosote area where they could smell creosote in that sort of place. I think there's probably some oil pollution in that surface microlayer. So that would be something to avoid if you could, because it's like it has PAHs, which are the toxic chemicals in cigarette smoke. So it's kind of comparable, probably not the same kind of dosing that you get from smoking a cigarette, but you're getting some of the same type of compounds absorbed through your skin if you're swimming in an area that's got that kind of pollution.
Great. Yeah, I'll kind of wondered that myself. If you can kind of smell it in the water or around you, be it creosote or like you mentioned, Nicole, kind of with the exhaust kind of smell from boats, that's not something we should be ignoring. Is that?
I think, yeah, it would take a lot years of exposure probably to cause real problems, but they don't fully understand how much it takes to. I mean, the concern there, you might get headaches, you might temporarily feel bad, but then there's a cancer risk. But usually that takes a long-term exposure. So you probably don't need to worry about it from just like it happening infrequently, but if you were doing that frequently, then that could lead to health risks.
Yeah. There's a question from the Mentimeter. What emerging contaminants could be risky for water contact? Are there any that come to mind that we've studied?
There aren't any that come to mind because the levels just aren't the exposure you get. The levels in the bay are pretty dilute. Parts per billion or parts per trillion or even lower than that, and they need to be more concentrated to cause health problems for humans.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, Andrea, thanks for joining. I see your hand.
I just wanted to actually back up what Jay just said. I spend a lot of my time right now working on PFAS. I've worked on mercury and pesticides and other things in the past. And even if I did some research actually before this call to see what other states were saying about chemicals like PFAS, which is an emerging contaminant. And even if it can be absorbed through the skin, and some contaminants can be, you're not talking about a major exposure route. You're getting that exposure probably to these chemicals in your own homes or, in your life anyway. Also, I noticed, I would never swim in the bay for the simple reason that it is cold. I admire what you do. But because of that, I saw in the picture, you're also covered up. If you have a major sore or cut on your body, you probably don't want to be in open water anyway, with just life out there. But I just wanted to support that. Yeah, there are some contaminants out there that can be absorbed, PCBs, bisphenols, PFAS can be absorbed through the skin, but it's usually because of products we're using on our bodies or are laying on and absorbing all the time. So, yes, thank you for being concerned about those contaminants, but I wouldn't stop swimming for those reasons.
And some of them would be a concern if you were drinking the water from the bay, but we don't do that. Like PFAS levels, they're quite low levels that cause health concern if you drink the water that's contaminated. But you guys aren't drinking the bay water, so that's a major exposure route that you don't have to worry about.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Nicole says a little bit of water, but that's not to worry about.
Well, there's a couple questions here also, and you mentioned kind of in your closing slides about algae blooms. And the last couple summers, there have been more instances of harmful algae blooms in the bay. And so just kind of a question, is it safe to swim during a red tide or kind of when there's an algae bloom that's happening? What do you think?
This isn't also an area that like I'm not a world expert on, and I didn't try to prepare on that topic for this
Yeah.
webinar. But I know enough. I feel comfortable recommending that you avoid swimming when there are toxic algae blooms. These chemicals can be extremely toxic, and I don't think we know. You know, we probably don't. There's probably a lot we don't know about the effects that they could have on humans due to contact recreational exposure. There probably is advice for this that I just didn't try to look up for this call for this webinar. But yeah, I think the general advice would be don't go in the water when there's algae blooms. Seems like every year there are some dog mortalities from dogs swimming in water bodies where there are algae blooms. So yeah, I wouldn't mess with swimming with algae blooms.
Yeah, thanks for that. How do you measure water quality?
Well, the bacteria data, they just go out with bottles and fill bottles, and there's a lot of different ways to measure all the things that we measure in the bay. Sometimes, for many things, it's a matter of filling bottles, and when we do that, we try to avoid that surface microlayer. So there are certain techniques that we use to get the samples collected in a consistent and uncontaminated way, without extraneous sources of contamination. We have sensors out on the bay for a lot of things. We pump water from the bay through filters. We have instruments that we dip down in the bay, like that first slide I showed about the RMP showed a sensor array that was hanging from a boat that was about to be deployed and put down in the water to measure things like temperature and dissolved oxygen and the amount of sediment in the water. So there's a lot of different ways of measuring water quality. Another one that I focus on a lot is we collect fish, and we look at the contaminants in fish, and that's one of the big drivers of regulation of contaminants in the bay, because PCBs and mercury and DDT and other contaminants, PFAS, accumulate through the food chain to high levels in the food web. So we measure the food web to look at water quality too.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And you touched on this about water quality changes based on the season and the rain. And there's a question here about if the water is safe for my dog to drink. So I guess we're kind of advising, the answer to that one would be no, I'm guessing. Not too much,
but probably not. If it was that they were living on that water supply, that would be a problem. If they drink a little bit, when they're swimming in the bay, I don't think that's a concern. But keep them away from the algae blooms. So
yeah. There's a question here about the impact of wastewater runoff from winter storms. I don't know if you want to speak to that, kind of what changes in the winter that makes the kind of waste from, we know stormwater runoff is bringing more pollutants down from our roads and our homes, our driveways into the bay. But then it seems, wastewater also has a higher risk of sewage overflows in the wet weather season. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I will. And I don't know, maybe you can you can chime in as well. But that is something that happens, especially when lately with climate change, we get some major flow and flood events and overwhelm the collection systems of our wastewater treatment plants. There's leakage into the systems that overwhelms the capacity of the treatment plants. San Francisco is the one city that's got a combined stormwater and sewage system, and so that the capacity, when there's really high stormwater flows, the capacity can get exceeded there. So there are during these really high flow events, there are cases where the sewage is going into the bay without full treatment, and that is an issue. The wastewater treatment plants track that, and it's something that the managers are tracking and are concerned about. So you think you had a link about the wastewater locations.
Yeah. Oh, kind of
Yeah.
that Baywise website. We'll kind of show you where your nearest wastewater treatment plant is or facility. And then the San Francisco Bay, Jay mentioned, has a combined system. So at times their wastewater and their stormwater are both flowing out to the bay in certain parts of the city. And so this link here will take you to show kind of weekly water quality data in those zones. Jay, there's
So I think maybe the advice there is, when we're having these really high flow periods, look at figure out where your wastewater facility is near where you swim and see what information they're providing. And then I would think that they probably notify. I know that they have to notify the water board when they're having overflow events. So find a way to track that and don't swim when there's an overflow event.
yeah,
It's not as bad as it might be, because in those situations, things are pretty dilute because there's so much water carrying the untreated wastewater into the bay that it's not as bad as you might think it is, because there's a lot of dilution happening too.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, thanks for joining. I see your hand, and I think this will be the last kind of question, and then we'll close it out.
Oh, it's a
Or
response.
comment, I bet.
It's a
Yeah.
response to that. No, anybody that has an overflow in their system or a bypass is required to report it. And the state board site, which I think you've correctly identified, makes an effort to get that up right away. I am not just the former chair of the Regional Water Quality Control Board. I windsurfed in the bay for about 44 years. And the current chair paddles in aquatic parks. So we kind of live this stuff, and it's important to us. So that data is available. And I just wanted to reinforce Jay's recommendations. Problems happen if there's a block, something generally associated with rain. They are required to report. You can find that. And if you want to go kayaking, if you want to go swimming, you can find a safe place, and you can find the high risk places. So Jay's advice was spot on. I just wanted to say that, and say that if you dig a little bit, you can find out what's happening in your local waters.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much, Jim. Great. Well, just with the last couple of minutes here, I wanted to leave you with a couple ideas or ways to get involved if you're inspired to do so. And one is that we have a volunteer opportunity here at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. There's a group of scientists that are looking at the pathways that microplastics, so the really small pieces of plastics that some of them you can't even see how they're getting into the bay. And they're actually looking at the lint that comes out of dryer vents as being a potential pathway to the bay. So Katie will paste in the link here in the chat if you're interested in volunteering as an individual, to have your dryer vent tested, or be a part of that study. But also, actually, more importantly, is if you want to encourage your local laundromat to participate. There's $200 that they can get in exchange for participating. So both of those links will be in the chat. We would love to have you stay in touch. I kind of alluded to this. I think the information is pretty disparate right now. And so if you have ideas about how we as at SFEI or with our partners could be doing a better job to potentially bring this information together, I think that's helpful. Where I mentioned at the opening here that we're working on our ways of communicating and connecting with folks in our community. So if you have ideas for us, or if you're, this giving season, the end of the season, we're starting a program here of becoming an estuary champion, and would love to have you join us because the science really does need you. Jim mentioned paddling in the bay, so I'll close with this one from this last weekend. And really, again, thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for the work, the fun, the joy that you have in swimming and loving the bay. It's such an essential part we have such a privilege of being here and getting to enjoy the bay. So thanks to Odyssey and to Alex and to Jay for sharing your expertise and insights, and Andrea for joining, and Jim for chiming in. This is great. So we'll follow up with all the links and the recording, but thanks again.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.